this party? How do we work together to make a difference? So I'm really encouraged by the increased level of awareness and engagement. And I was in Paris meeting with investors in December, and every one of those meetings we had somebody from the ESG portion of the firm with us. That wouldn't have been the case 2 years ago. We've been talking about our purpose as a company and our strategy and thriving through the energy transition, shifting the products and services we offer, changing our portfolio through time. I felt some lack of patience, if you will, with the investors perhaps a couple of years ago. It's nice that that's not the case, because I think we all need to be on the same page in terms of this needs to happen and Shell needs to be a part of the solution. So I'm encouraged that I think the investment community is getting more tuned in. I think the challenge, as I mentioned before, is how do you frame that? What does good look like? How do you assess Shell? And you know, half of our business is natural gas. We believe that is a really critical contribution to changing the CO2 footprint on the planet. If we can move more power from coal to gas, it's one of the fastest, easiest, lowest cost solutions on the planet. And getting people to understand that and embrace that, as well as moving into renewable energy and other solutions. But to move at pace, I think natural gas is going to be an important piece of it. So having people think of the problem in the same way, recognize the coordination that's needed, I think it's moving in the right direction, but we all need to move more quickly.
I mean, David, you started, I think you were telling me earlier, 16 years ago, yes, started Generation with this as an idea. So how would you, to what extent would you say that the movement has caught up, and how much further would you say, or kind of what's the next challenge?
Well, it's certainly different today than it was 16 years ago. When I retired from Goldman Sachs and told my partners I was going to set up a sustainable investing firm, they basically laughed and said, "You are crazy." And probably they were right about that. But what's been important over this journey is that the framework, the business framework, the investment framework, the understanding that sustainability is drivers of economies, and that ESG are issues, are tools to understand businesses or manage businesses, is becoming very much the business case and very much recognized. And that's kind of the important point. The second point I want to make is that increasingly we need to recognize there is no difference between ESG and regular investing. It's all business, it's all investing. And pretty soon the notion of having these specialist folks, I think, isn't going to exist. When Larry Fink says sustainability is mainstream, well, it pretty much is now mainstream. Now what is going to change is the rigor of these conversations and the importance of disclosure, the importance of the debate, as Jessica was saying, and the sort of the journey around that next step. It isn't always a win-win. It isn't always one thing or another. It's extremely complicated, it's interlinked, and it's going to get harder. And we need to recognize that as we go forward.
Which I think brings an interesting point around the comparability of that data and the efficiency of markets, because we know markets work efficiently when you've got that comparable data out there. And actually, in the introductory comments around the data providers, if you think about the millions which have been spent on that particular industry, I think it's like over 500 million 2018, and it's going to be north of 750 million going into 2020. Because in the end of the day, data is going to be very important, but at the same time, we have to recognize that if we can bring in some standardizations, and hence we welcome, obviously, Mark Carney's appointment today in terms of actually putting some global frameworks, be it around risk management, but equally, what are these definitions of ESG and the definitions of the Sustainable Development Goals? So with the involvement also with the accounting firms, which have also been now part of the dialogue, which arguably were absent only a year ago, all of this is very encouraging, because you start bringing in this standardization. And then, as you say, everything becomes ESG. There's that filter there, which in the end of the day will drive the cost of capital and even the access to capital.
There is kind of I'm sort of interested in some of your views on this. I mean, there is an assumption behind that debate. I mean, I agree with you on this, but there is an assumption that if you could only improve the disclosure and sort of standardize the disclosure, then markets will efficiently take care of business. And obviously, we can all think of examples not that long ago where markets didn't actually get it right, and then we had a sudden violent adjustment. What are we being a bit too sort of optimistic about the ability of markets to even with better information, markets to sort of look into the future properly, David?
Well, so I think when Governor Carney, along with Mayor Bloomberg, began to develop the Task Force on Climate Change Disclosure initiatives, partly it was about disclosure and getting better information into the conversation. But we made it very clear that we wanted to talk about opportunities, we wanted to talk about risks, and we wanted to make this a conversation that was more qualitative around governance. And so the standards, the TCFD standards, is one page. It was deliberately one page because we wanted commentary around that for the very point that you were making. Is disclosure is important, but actually the content of that disclosure and the implications of that disclosure is what is most important.
But is there also, I mean, again, Sarah, as a regulator, obviously you have to sort of, I imagine the thinking on this has changed quite a lot from where it was, 10, 11, 12 years ago. You can't just sort of trust markets to deal with it properly.
No, you would never just trust markets. Right. But what you can do as a regulator is ensure that companies that are taking risk, banks, insurers, asset managers and asset owners, have got the right information on which to make a judgment, and talk to them about how they have made that judgment and decide whether or not they've got adequate financial resources consistent with the risks that they're running. We all know that deep down there's an externality here that is not being priced. What regulation of the financial industry can do is try and get visibility and internalize that externality. But then it does go to what David said, that there's a massive opportunity here as well as a prudential regulator. That's not my main focus, but there is a huge opportunity here to finance the economy-wide transformation that is needed. And what you get by focusing on the risk is an awareness of where change needs to happen, where government policy needs to be clear, and then what finance can do is pull forward that transition in as orderly a way as possible in order to deliver the lowest risk outcome for it.
Yes, and I guess that's sort of implicit in a lot of this discussion is that at some point investors are going to wake up.
That's right.
But is that, how do you see that happening? Do you see that happening as a gradual process, or do you see that happening in a sort of sudden kind of Wile E. Coyote running off the edge of the cliff kind of way? What's your perception of that, Jessica?
Just to comment on the last question first, I'm a believer in the power of markets, but I'd say with this challenge, we don't have the time to wait for markets to thrash it out. We need to move at a pace that we don't have the luxury of time for markets to sort itself out. To the extent we can price things appropriately, if we can price carbon appropriately and stimulate market responses in the right way, I think that's good. But it requires greater coordination, I keep going back to the same point, between governments, business, and consumers to move at pace, because leaving it just to the market, I think, won't get us to where we need to be as quickly as we need to be. What we're trying to support in Shell is a sectorial approach. So how do we look at the aviation sector, the shipping sector, and work with all players across that value chain and say, how do we decarbonize? And trying to encourage that coordination, because it's not happening naturally. I'm sorry, your second question?
It was about the sort of the speed or the violence of the adjustment, I guess.
I'm not seeing it.
No.
It could happen. I think what I'm worried about is it not happening in a way that's sufficiently wise to generate the right outcomes. And this is where, because unfortunately, there's just not an easy answer. If there was an easy answer, just stop something, but how do you change, a kind of $50, $80 trillion system, 80% of all energy, which is vital to people's lives every day, to their quality of lives, to their safety, to the security, to prosperity. there's not just an easy solution. And so if it were just about redirecting capital, if we knew where to do that, I think that would be great. But unfortunately, this is too complex of a problem, and we do need to do some real work to figure out what are the practical solutions and then allocate the capital appropriately.
Sarah, you've talked about this idea of a Minsky moment, sort of suddenly kind of there'll be a sort of an adjustment or a kind of a recognition in the markets. I mean, is that you're warning, you're trying to sort of avoid that, or you're...
That's absolutely what we're trying to do. The later we leave the adjustment that we've all been talking about, the greater the probability of the climate Minsky moment and Wile E. Coyote running off the cliff and finding there's a long way to drop. And so what we're doing is trying to raise awareness of this risk, emphasize that the sooner we start the transition, the lower the likelihood of those very, very severe destabilizing outcomes. We can't rule them out, but our aim is by showing that there's an early and orderly way or a later and more disorderly way that finance will realize it's in its own commercial interest to be on this path, not that one. Yeah. And I think an important part of that is recognizing the two themes that have been implicit in what we've said, but let's call them out, that the financial system is not going to be able to divest itself of this risk. The financial system is a mirror of the real economy and will reflect those risks. So divestment is not an entire solution here. Similarly, neither is it going to be able to diversify it away from it either. And I think once you've realized that kind of you can't divest your way out of it, you can't diversify your way out of it, you have to risk manage your way out of it, that then prompts the kinds of changes, the transformational changes, which are hard and complex and need government, business, finance, consumers, financial regulators all to be working together. But once we get to that point, I think we reduce the probability of those more severe outcomes.
And I would just say that Sarah's point is really quite important. And that's why the opportunity set and understanding the opportunity set is critical. So the $26 trillion or probably more that needs to be deployed, that's how you diversify out of the risk. And Jessica's right. Shell has been, I think, among the most thoughtful energy businesses around, trying to lead this transition. But it's hard. And generation, we're not clever enough to time that. So we actually do think that it will be quite a transformation and it will be a cliff edge type of scenario. We have not owned a hydrocarbon security for 10 years. And the reason we don't is that we don't think the market is properly pricing the hydrocarbon complex. And not to say that Shell isn't terrific, they are, but we as fiduciaries do not want to take that risk. We think that would be a mistake for what we're trying to do, and we would rather allocate our capital to the transition in advance, because we're just not clever enough to know when this change is going to happen.
What kind of work can you tell us about that's going on in terms of actually trying to price this or trying to work this out? Because it seems like we spend a lot of time talking about it in broad terms. But how much actually do you find people are crunching the numbers and actually making real decisions on this?
Absolutely. I think you're starting to see it across the spectrum. And I think, we've obviously got the asset management side, but, the hedge fund community are very heavily engaged in this topic now. In the private equity space, you in M&A situations, there's carbon accounting which is taking place. As we all know, what is the right price of carbon? But needless to say, now when you're looking at M&A opportunities, the way in which you're looking at them is very different. It's just not the typical financial numbers that you've historically focused on, but actually carbon is a very critical part of it.
And that is people saying, we're going to assume that at some point there's going to be a carbon tax or something that will force us to...
Absolutely, and then is that company ultimately viable or not? going forward. And I think it also goes beyond also, if you look at the supply chains as well, it's just not anchored around carbon, but obviously the environmental impacts. There's been numerous trades that we've seen which have not happened despite the returns making a lot of sense, but actually the risks associated, be it with their supply chains because ecological, or be it around the human rights aspect, they're no longer wanting to take those risks. Now, a year ago, they probably would have taken those risks. This is in, be it in various industries, be it chocolate industries or the others, entertainment industries, be it animal-related or others. So you've already started to see the shifts taking place where people are stepping away from some of these assets. But the reality is, as we know, it hasn't had, the big impact. But going back to markets, you could look at the German utilities, and we've already started to see the impact there. But I don't think it's just been driven and potentially around the price of carbon, which we all know is ultimately going to be required, and people all appreciate at the outcome of COP25, and with the hopes on COP26 around this discussion. But in actual fact, what governments are doing by setting targets are already having impacts in terms of the pace of the transition, which I think you see very clearly, be it with the automobile sector, for instance, the impact that's had on phasing out petrol and diesel cars in certain jurisdictions across the world. You see the pace of change happening in that way as well. And I think targets equally have such a big impact as well. And that's where government and policy obviously have a play to role in directing it. But I think this opportunity aspect is massive, and we can't underestimate it. It's not just financing the energy transition, which we do a lot of with Shell. They've obviously bought offshore wind farms. We help finance. If you look at their last revolving credit facility, they put in terms and conditions in there to help meet their net zero carbon. So that's equally encouraging, but that ultimately represents 25% of what this investable opportunity is there. You've got the transport sector, you've got the smart cities there, you've got the food and agricultural sector there. So there's a lot out there where we're trying to spend a lot of time on, and especially around the new technologies, which we ultimately know are required to help meet these net zero targets.
And if I might build on that, I think my impression from what we've seen talking to financial institutions is that there may be bits of the business where the awareness of the risks and opportunities is very clear, but this is an economy-wide transition, and this is not embedded yet across the entirety of the financial system. And that's what we're trying to do to make sure this isn't just a conversation about the energy sector and Shell. It's a conversation about the transition that needs to be made absolutely everywhere across the economy. And I think that's the sense in which we're still in the foothills, and we
Right.
need to go further. Can
I just because obviously we're Breakingviews and we do a lot of sort of number crunching, and also this is hopefully a reasonably sophisticated financial audience. Can I ask a question about cost of capital? Because people throw this term around and say, well, that kind of banks change or investors change or whatever affects the cost of capital. But as the CFO of a big company, you're not issuing equity to finance things, are you? You're obviously operating in the debt markets, but you're also generating a lot of cash. What sort of registers on the radar screen in terms of sort of changes in the cost of overall capital for you?
So I think you're asking, how are we thinking this risk will be priced? Is that the question you're asking?
Well, or how do changes in the cost of funding or the cost of whatever, or kind of how the equity markets look at things, how does that change decision making?
How does it change decision making? Clearly we need to deliver what we call a world-class investment case. We need to attract capital. We need to retain that capital. And so how this issue plays out in terms of attracting and retaining capital, what the cost of capital may be, is that the gist of your conversation? Clearly that's on our mind. In terms of how we're pricing it, we price it differently in terms of we price carbon, it's embedded in our investment decisions. We're looking at our business, we're running it against different scenarios and pricing and looking at our valuation through different lenses.
I guess my question was, we talk a lot about Larry Fink and sort of the fund managers. Maybe should we be paying more attention to, the rating agencies or kind of, the people who are buying who are providing the debt financing to the business.
I mean, I think we're having this conversation with debt and equity markets, and the equity markets, the pricing piece is interesting. I think equity markets want to make sure they understand that's risk inherent in our cash flows going forward, and from a strategic perspective, do we have solutions in place and the right strategy in place to ensure that we'll be a leading energy company 10, 20 years down the road? And that's what we're working to provide confidence in, that we're generating solutions in terms of shifting the products and services we're offering and the portfolio over time, such that our business will be thriving through the energy transition 10 or 20 years down the road. With the debt markets, it's the same thing. You know, we have long-term debt. They need to have confidence that our cash flows will be strong 10, 20, 30 years down the road. And so it's the same discussion. Do you have confidence in our cash flows? Do you have resiliency in our cash flows through different scenarios? And what is your strategy to ensure that you're relevant and not only relevant, but thriving in the coming decades?
I just going to say we have about 20 minutes left, but also if you do want to submit questions, then use that Slido app or the website that you used at the beginning, and you can hopefully those questions will pop up on a screen here that I will then be able to look at them rather than disappearing into the ether somewhere. Okay, I mean, I think all of you have mentioned sort of opportunities a bit. So let's talk about the sort of the upside. Can we be specific? Like, what if we're going to leave here with a hopefully slightly more hopeful than when we came in, or maybe not? What are the sort of the specific sort of positive opportunities that you see as you look at this issue and this transition, Alexandra? Bankers are always optimistic.
Well, I think one has to be, and I think even, going back to this data and disclosure, if you think of where we've come from and where we are now, if you look at the CDP data, I mean, we've gone well from like in the hundreds to over 6,000 or so. So I think we do need to look at this agenda in a very positive way, because in the end of the day, that's what brings people on board as well around the agenda. And as Sarah alluded to, this is the whole economy. This is, all of our bankers understanding absolutely there's a risk there, but actually look at the revenue opportunities we have if we can finance these sectors, which are either going through transition, which is hugely important to the heart of our business strategy and arguably for the whole banking sector. But I mentioned some of the sectors we're looking at, and even only a couple of days ago, we're doing an IPO for a disruptor in terms of the cement making industry. Why they're able to, new technologies are able to reduce the carbon footprint of how you make cement. I mean, these opportunities are really quite exciting, and I think this is where this positiveness can come from. You learn about the hydrogen. I mean, every day you think about, wow, these windmills not only can provide energy, but in actual fact, you can actually capture the hydrogen by doing electrolysis, excuse me, I did my chemistry, but the word came out in terms of then capturing it. So rather than having these big oil tankers out there, we can actually have these hydrogen tankers. And we've seen already in the UK that you can start doing hydrogen blending in terms of through our own gas network. All of these opportunities need to be financed ultimately. And so therefore the opportunities are real, they're here today, and there's going to be a lot more of them. I think for us, the challenge we have is, the investable projects at this point in time, there's not probably enough of them. We like them to be identified. And if you've got to remember, it's not just a European issue, it's a global issue. And therefore, how can we effectively reduce some of the risk of it? And therefore, working together in this blended finance format is actually going to probably be something which we'll see a lot more of. And so that's involving the public sector and the private sector to really putting investable opportunities out there. We're also seeing a shift in terms of the asset management side. I think, they're playing a much bigger role in terms of the financing as well. So we're hugely encouraged, recognizing that we really don't have a choice on this agenda. We know it's a race we've got to win, and we know we can win it. And I think that's the attitude we like to take, at least at BNP Paribas.
So David, you were talking about what you didn't own earlier. So what do you own?
Well, I think part of the conversation that is important to reiterate is that we are really talking about the entire economy. And yes, we can talk about the energy transition and the energy complex. That is a critical component. But so is agriculture, so is water, so is the built environment, so is mobility, so is healthcare, as an aside. And by the way, financial inclusion matters a lot. We cannot have a energy transition or transition to a no-carbon economy without a just transition. And so, excuse me, you have to understand how markets and access to capital work for individuals. And so it's a very broad opportunity set for us. It's not just energy. It's much different than that.
You're not going to give us a stock recommendation.
I see a question there for you.
Yes, I see. And I fortunately have been at this game long enough to know that my compliance officer would be sad.
Very wise. It's very important to keep compliance officers
Yes,
happy.
he would be sad.
We see a couple of these questions now. I thought maybe one that Sarah might like to take. I mean, I think this is about due to the additional. It's from Graham apparently. This is due to the additional costs of supervising green investment. Could regulatory incentive be improved to motivate the financial industry?
So I think it's really important that regulation reflects risk, and what our exploratory scenario that we're going to undertake this year into next will give us a much better understanding of that risk. It's not as simple as saying thermal coal bad, wind farms good, because as we've all been emphasizing, this is an economy-wide transition. What we are hoping to do, therefore, through our stress test is get a sense of who's managing this risk well and which firms are not managing this risk well. And it's possible that we could have incentives operate in that way. It's really, really important that it reflects regulatory financial requirements reflect risk. And we need to do as good a job we can of working out where this risk will crystallize economy-wide, recognizing that to fossil fuel companies, to farms, to mortgagees could have very different exposures to the future risks that this phenomenon will bring.
Right, so there is this idea that you should actually be taking bank risk weightings and applying a sort of a calculation that says, you know, this type of loan in the future will be more risky than it was in the past.
That's right. That's the green supporting factor that Alexandra mentioned. Like I say, I just think the world is not as simple as green and brown. There's quite a lot of yellow around, and much of the yellow will be trending either to green or staying yellow. And I think our approach to thinking about regulation needs to reflect that. But to be clear, it's on our agenda. We know we need to think about it because regulatory requirements need to reflect risk, and there is for sure risk here. I just don't think it's a simple solution.
Jessica actually made the point, and I think it's worth reiterating it. This isn't just a financial question. This isn't just a regulatory question. This isn't a consumer question. It isn't a public policy question. It's all of those things, and they will all be interlinked. What we need to imagine, though, is that it's going to move much more quickly. This is the one thing that Larry Fink said that I think we really need to keep in front of mind is that this is going to happen much more quickly than you imagine. And it's going to happen in ways that we can't predict, but it's going to happen within sort of the next 3 to 5 years. And a lot of what we've been doing from a allocation of capital to risk management to regulatory, it's going to fundamentally change. And we just need to get comfortable with the transformation that is in front of us. But it's all aspects of the economy and all aspects of players, all stakeholders in this economy.
So there's a saying, a lot of companies obviously make sure that they're ultimately, when the recession comes, recession-proof. So arguably one needs to make sure that they're transition/transformation-proof. And how you go about that is obviously some of the comments that Sarah mentioned in terms of raising the awareness across the whole economy, but then obviously when you get specifically into organizations, especially in the financial sector, for people to really appreciate what does this mean, and this is across obviously client facing, it means traders, it means the risk takers, it means the back office. It requires a lot of education and awareness, and I think we're very much at the beginning of that. I mean, we've gone through a vast amount of training with the Cambridge Sustainable Institute of Leadership, where we've had over 600 bankers go through it. But if you look fundamentally at the financial industry, climate and change or risk is not a natural discipline to a lot of people. And I think, you know, we have chief economists out there, you know, very much working along with our credit analysts and along with others. And you start thinking to yourself, you know, do we need chief scientists sitting alongside our bankers as well? Because in the end of the day, you know, science is going to drive a lot of this. And we really need to understand what's going to be happening in these next 10 years and how that in turn is going to impact economies. We've already started to see it in Australia. The impact on the GDP is already going to come through with those fires. And that's not a unique situation. There getting these extreme weather events now once a week across the globe.
Okay, we're trying to leave people on an optimistic note. So Jessica, are there any opportunities, sunlit uplands you can point us towards?
Absolutely. I am a believer in the capacity of humans to do good and in human ingenuity. We have a lot of solutions today that aren't fully deployed, as I said. We could, you know, switching from coal to gas is one of the things that we can do, you know, in the coming years, make a significant difference. There's a lot more electrification that can happen. There's more renewable power that we can put onto the planet. And then there's the next generation of technology that's needed for liquid fuels, whether it's biofuels or hydrogen. There's CCS, carbon capture and storage, and there's nature-based solutions. And at Shell, we're working all of those because we think the combination of all of those solutions are going to be needed. And in that, we see opportunity.
Again, just to pick out a few more questions. One from George Hay, which my colleague George Hay, which I'm going to ask to you, David, because you were ahead of Larry Fink on this. You know, how far are we from BlackRock deciding to divest from oil and gas, as well as thermal coal, which obviously was the statement that came out this week?
Yes. Well, it was divesting from coal has been an easy thing to do for quite some time as an investment manager. The risk reward has been clear for a long while. So I wouldn't, I think somebody from the Extinction Rebellion said that most folks aren't going to be too worried about BlackRock's statement in that regard because it's sort of old news. I think our approach has always been to try to understand the risk of the hydrocarbon sector, and there's no question that there will continue to be hydrocarbons used over the course of the next 10, 20 years. The question is understanding how quickly that might change, the innovation, public policy, regulations associated with that. What we'll find is that some number of the oil and gas industry are not moving quickly. One of the reasons why we need better disclosure is to begin to ascertain which groups are moving quickly, like Shell, and which groups actually are not moving at all. And they will begin to divest, not as a matter of we're divesting from oil and gas. They will divest because it's a bad investment. And that's the fundamental point. The pricing of that security will be incorrect, and they will divest. So I think it will happen more quickly than people think. Some energy businesses will be outstanding, and they'll be financed, but quite a few will be poor, and they will not be financed. And that's true for the debt markets as well as the equity markets.
Okay. Maybe I'll just take one or two more. I think we've covered quite a lot of this. Actually, one just about, because we do actually have in our book, there's a prediction about the network for greening the financial system, the body of, I won't ask you the specific question there, but just sort of in terms of drawing in, I mean, the Bank of England has obviously been very prominent on this with Mark Carney and yourself. How is it going in terms of drawing in other central banks from around the world on this?
So this coalition of willing central banks and supervisors was set up 2 years ago, and at the time it was set up, there were 8 founder members. Now, 2 and a bit years later, we're at 54, I think, with 12 observers. Now, I didn't make a prediction 2 years ago as to how big I thought we would be in 2 years. But I'm damn sure I would not have said 54. The rate at which the central banks and supervisors have recognized that this is an issue has surprised me on the upside. Now, there are different maturities there around the table. There are some people like the Dutch, like the French, like ourselves, who've been thinking quite deeply about this issue for a while, and there are some others who are new to it. But what's great is that everybody's there sharing their experience. So the stress test that I described that the UK is going to undertake, we're taking all of that knowledge into the NGFS and we're sharing it. And the NGFS is going to publish some scenarios in April. They can be used for TCFD disclosures. They can be used by other central banks. So I've been hugely surprised on the upside by the swell of support, the willingness to engage from the central banking and supervisory community. And I'm hopeful that they will prove to be real agents for change across the globe.
And if I can just echo something on there, because obviously a lot of these are our regulators across the globe, and I think what the NGFS has ultimately been able to provide is a platform, and I think while we don't like to call them bank stress tests at this early stage, because I think, the stress tests that we go under, be it they're not as yet, as you can understand, nearly as sophisticated in terms of where we are in terms of managing market risk or credit risk. But needless to say, the approach that the Bank of England's taking is hugely encouraging. And I think ultimately the target should be to have some form of internationalized role around this. And I think that leadership which the NGFS has brought together will clearly be very helpful, because let's not forget, we don't want duplication. Resources are scarce around this topic. And I think if we can get some form of internationalization, utilizing the leadership that we've obviously seen both from the Europeans and the Bank of England more broadly, it will be hugely encouraging.
So Peter, just to keep with the spirit of bold predictions and to speak of the spirit of positiveness, the question, Peter was being very polite, the question was specific to people with accents like mine. And so my bold prediction, whether or not Mr. Trump is reelected, is that there will be a price on carbon in the United States of America within the next 5 years, led by the Republicans. It is no longer taboo to talk about carbon, climate change as a Republican. And I can tell you right now that in the Senate, as well as in the House, that issue is changing. It's changing because the young Republicans are onto it. And it's changing because basically most of Americans are onto the issue as well. And it's not sustainable to pretend like it doesn't exist. And so you'll see that change.
Right. And well, just to follow up on your prediction with one of our own, which is in the book, which is, I think one of the argument that I think my colleague Rob Cox made is that one of the best ways for the Federal Reserve to demonstrate its independence from the president would be to join the Network for Greening the Financial System. So come back in a year's time and see whether that one has proved correct or not. We're almost out of time, but what I want to do before we wrap this up and let you all have a drink and talk amongst each other and with the panelists about everything you've heard this evening is, again, come back to you and ask you to make a few more predictions. So once again, you have my permission to play with your phones and go to slido.com, and hopefully this question will come up. So we have a prediction in the book which talks about climate activism. Who knows, it might even be David who turns out to be the climate activist, but one thing we're talking about is investors getting on board companies and becoming an activist with them with a view to getting them to change their approach to the climate. So 5 companies for you to choose from: ExxonMobil, Saudi Aramco, News Corp, Wells Fargo, and Altria. And we seem to have a fairly strong consensus there. Saudi Aramco would be difficult because I think you can only buy 2.5% of the shares at the moment, but give it a shot. Okay, that's a good one, and we're getting a good response on that. The next one then is a bit more conventional, very straightforward. Which investment will perform best in the coming year? SoftBank, Blackstone, BlackRock, the British pound, or crude oil? It's a very patriotic crowd here, great, bullish on the British economy, quite bullish on the pound. So Blackstone rather than BlackRock, that's interesting. Although actually they're sort of vying for 1 and 2. And actually, again, just to encourage you to read the book, which you will obviously do anyway, there is in fact, there was a neck and neck. You see, there is a prediction in the book that talks about that maybe one of the things might happen this year is that the Blackstone and BlackRock, which obviously, as some of you may know, originally was one firm and then kind of went their separate ways, that they might be reunited in some way. And then the final question is, which of these is most likely to be extinct by 2030? So this one with a slightly longer time frame. This one you'll have to come back in 10 years to check what your predictive qualities were. Again, maybe not representative of the population at large, but nonetheless interesting. And obviously everybody's using their iPhone, so they're going to stick with that one.
Exactly.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much. So as I said, we have drinks and nibbles for all of you. So please hang around and continue the conversation. But before you do that, please join me in thanking the panel for this excellent conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
Very good. Very good. Thank you very much.